So we've been going through the Old Testament, and we kind of went through a theological approach to the Old Testament, and we've been looking at the structure, the way that the Jewish Bible has been broken down, called the Tanakh, the three major sections of the Old Testament. And it starts off with the Torah. Can anyone tell me the books in the Torah?
Genesis, Deuteronomy, right?
Yep, so it's the first 5 books of the law. Right? And they set the foundation for the entire Bible. Okay? They set the foundational framework for promise, for presence, for law, law-keeping, law-abiding, atonement, all the necessary ingredients that go into salvation, that go into the plan, especially Jesus coming in, right? We're going to plug Jesus in as we get into our New Testament. It has all the framework. And so really what you see in the first 5 books of the Bible is the ideal life that Israel should have lived. And you see some of their failures, right, in Exodus, but God was kind of with them, and they were infants, we'll say. They were in their infancy. So God had a lot of grace and mercy with them because they were babies, literally babies. You know, day one, imagine, living in Egypt for 300 years. Your family had lived in Egypt for 300 years, and God just kind of goes, okay, we're going, get up, let's go. And now they've got to all of a sudden change their ways. I mean, sometimes we give the Israelites a hard time, but I want you to imagine if God came down right now, said, okay, everybody, let's grab your stuff, sell all your things, we're going to a land you've never been. And it may take us several years to get there. You got to trust me. Or you think there's going to be any kind of complaints that come up? When you're walking all day, when you're having to put up tents rather than living in homes, especially today, all right? This last week, how cold was it? Imagine, right? Me and Ashley, when we drove back from South Carolina, we drove through this one little town. We had to stop, but right off the side of the gas station, there had to be at least 15 or 20 tents set up. And that was the day where it was feels like negative, 14. And I'm going, man, that's got to be cold. And it's unfortunate people live that way. But I just, think about it for a moment. Though Egypt was hard, you had a place to stay, you had a home. And a lot of times people can manage their own situation, even if they're living in a bad situation, if they've kind of succumbed to it. You know what I'm saying? It's kind of their reality. It's what they know. And as long as it's what they know and they've kind of given into it, even slavery can be something that is comforting. And when you draw people out of it, even when we abolish slavery, there are a lot of slaves who ended up doing what? Becoming servants, becoming indentured slaves. Now some because they owed, but there's a lot of political and social stuff. But I wrote a lot of books that a lot of slaves didn't know what to do. And so they basically said, well, can you pay me to serve in your house? Doing the same things they were doing, getting paid because that's what they know. And so what you see in the first 5 books is this nation forming, God giving them kind of the foundational laws. And Exodus and Leviticus are kind of like the hardcore, do this, do this, do this, do this, do this, do this. We watch them fail in the wilderness, right? They try to go into the promised land. They fail. They don't have the faith to go in. They wander for 40 years. And then Deuteronomy is really the main key. How it ends is to serve the Lord with all of your heart. And that becomes the major phrase over and over and over again found in the book of Deuteronomy, is to serve God with all your heart. And what's the difference between hearing do this, do this, do this, do this, and then, but now do this with all your heart. Do this with all your heart. Do this with all your heart. What's the difference in when you're perceiving do with all your heart, do with all your heart, do with all your heart? What's the difference in that?
I think the difference would be you get these set of rules and you're told to do this and that's what you do. But
yeah.
You're not into it, as opposed to if you do something you like to do, your heart's more into it. So he wants you to serve him with your heart more than following the rules. Am I getting that wrong?
Yeah. Well, so there's a part of it. So remember being an Israelite. you were born into this system of religion. What God wanted it to become was not just something you were born into. It's kind of like Catholics today, right? I'm from the north, so you guys have Baptists like I had Catholics. Catholics were just Catholics because they were born into it. They didn't go to Mass. They may have gone to Christmas Mass, right, or Easter Mass, but they weren't real religious people. But if you ask them, hey, what's your religious belief? Oh, I'm Catholic. Jesus is my Lord and Savior. And you're kind of going, but is it really yours? Or was this something you were born into? And so for Israel, they were born into it. And what God wanted to do was He wanted it to become their religion because they chose to follow God, not just because they were born into a family that had to follow God.
That's funny that you bring that up. I was raised Catholic.
Yeah.
And a good friend of mine was Methodist or Lutheran. But anyway, I remember him and I talking, and we couldn't have been that old. I mean, maybe second grade, somewhere third grade, somewhere in there. But I remember this conversation, and they hadn't gone to church Sunday morning. And I said to him, really, you didn't go to church? And he said, no. And I said, don't you have to? And he said, well, no, we go because we want to. We go to worship and we go because we want to. And he said, do you have to go to church? And I'm like, oh yeah. Like the priests are going to come after us. And I thought about that through the years of what that was like in your heart. Like, it's like, I had a real fear and healthy respect of priests and nuns.
Yeah.
Not necessarily God. I loved God and I knew who God was, but I was more afraid and kept the rules because of the nuns and the priests.
Yeah.
And so it was like, that makes perfect sense to do this with all your heart because you want to please God and worship God. And, so when you bring that up about being Catholic, it was,
Yeah.
My version too is like, a lot of people were brought up in the church in today's world, be the church, and you just know. Like, I was later, that's why I ask these crazy questions and not drive them crazy. But,
You don't drive us crazy.
So that's why I see things differently because even though I was started younger, but then as I got older, I didn't. So now all these things I see differently. And that's why I ask all these great questions. But I mean, that's kind of like the same thing where now all these kids are taught this as, kids, and they just grow up and they just know.
Yeah.
And they don't question anything, where, like I said, I'm later in it, and so that's why I have all these questions. That's like today's version of it.
Yeah, well, and even the same thing. Kids who are raised in Catholic is just, for me, was easier to see because that's what I knew. But it's really, even in the Church of Christ, right? You got people who are just, why are you Church of Christ? Well, my granddad was Church of Christ. Like, that to me rubs me wrong when someone says, well, why do you go to the Church of Christ? Because my mom, because my dad. Well, what about you? Like, what if they were not a part of it, right? What if they, left it? Would you follow? What if they just decide to become Muslim? I don't know. Would you go because your mom or dad is that? And we start, and if we're not careful, even, in the Church of Christ, we start dividing over our own schisms because we all have our own flavor of Church of Christ even, right? You start, my church, where I was born, where I was raised, did this. Okay, and? Well, you guys do it like this. Okay, and? Like, are they biblical? So that gets back to kind of your thing. We need to raise our kids in a way where questions are welcome, because where I was raised, questions were not welcomed. I was raised in the church, but if you asked a question, it's one of the reasons that led me away from the church. I've probably told my story several times, but I walked away from the church for about 9 years. And it was because I would ask, well, why? I visited my friend's church and they did we don't do that. Why? Bible says it. Well, why? That's just the way we do it. Okay. That to me is not a good answer. It's not a good framework. It's not a good thing to put in your kid's head. Well, let's talk about it. And let every question be asked, because if they're asking it now, they're going to ask it at another time. And if you've shut them down here, guess who they're going to ask when they're older? Probably not you. They're probably going to ask someone else, and who knows what answer they'll give them. right? So kind of in this, once again, it was the same thing in the early church. Like the early church, and that's what we're going to see how similar the book of Acts to me is basically our Exodus story. It's the emergent church. We've come out of captivity. We're on fire for the Lord, right? We're ready to go. We're gung-ho, and people are kind of, doing their thing. And then, and we're going to get in this, Paul, 5, 10, 15, 20 years later, has to write to these same Christians going, what are you doing? You started off so good when it was pure and when it was just, why are you in this? Because I love Jesus. And unfortunately, a lot of times the more the church becomes more institutionalized and more organizational, and we're more focused on structure and organization, we have fights that like, why are we fighting about? That's not even a Bible fight. Like that's not even, now it's a non-Bible fight. And that's what Israel got themselves into. And so, but here's part 2 to this love the Lord with all your heart aspect. One of the things that I have come to the conclusion of, especially I've been teaching this kind of hard in my Leviticus class on Sunday nights, is God designed the law for us to understand that we could not keep it. You think about that. He designed it to be that when you actually sat down and you laid out all the things that God asked you to do, you personally could not keep it. We've been talking about the sacrifices in the book of Leviticus. There was if you were to keep up on all the sacrifices you had to commit every time you thought a bad thought or sinned or hurt somebody or said the wrong thing, there's literally not enough animals in the world to keep up with it. And Paul actually learns that. In Romans 7, that's his big thing. Like he's like, I finally read the law for the first time with Jesus in mind, and I realized the law is perfect. And it's nothing wrong with the law. It's everything wrong with me. Every time I tried to keep it, I actually became a worse, because he goes, the more I had to study about covetousness and what it was, what did he say he became the more he learned about covetousness? He didn't become less covetous when he learned more about it. He learned, wow, I'm even more covetous than I thought I was, because I really understand now what covetousness actually is the more you read. And he's seeing, he's not getting closer to what perfection looks like. The more he read it, the more he realized how far he was away from perfection. And what it was really teaching us was that we were unworthy of God's grace and presence and promise that he gave us in Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, to actually read and go, wow, he showed a lot of grace and a lot of mercy to not wipe us out. And we deserved every bit of it. Who can rescue us from this but Jesus? Okay? And so Deuteronomy kind of ends with this. I don't want to trivialize, but this statement helps us. Do your best. It's kind of do it with all your heart. Meaning, God knows you can't keep up with the sacrifice system. Like nobody was rich enough, especially poor people. They couldn't have kept up with the amount of sacrifices they could have had to give. But it's kind of like Jesus explains the widow with two mites. 2 mites was not enough according to the law to pay for her sin. But it was enough for God because he saw the heart behind it, the intentionality behind it. She was trying and she was striving. Because if you really think about it, that's why I think it's really a parable of this widow, because if she gave everything that she had, and she's a widow, she probably doesn't have an income stream coming in. What is she giving next week? Right? What is she giving next week? How is she eating? So I think the point is this: Jesus is showing that what he's really looking for is someone who's willing to give it all, realizes they can't. It's kind of like even with the rich man, when Jesus says, he tells the rich man to go sell everything. I think it was a test. I think if the guy said, okay, I'm going to go sell everything, Jesus goes, I was just kidding. Like, what I wanted to see was, are you willing to? Is your heart ready to go, you know what, I'll give it all up for you? Because Jesus didn't really ask that of anybody besides this guy, because he knew what that one guy was lacking. Because he asked. You ask Jesus, what's the one thing that I lack? He's going to tell you. And it's going to hurt. Well, the Old Testament was for them to understand and read, what am I lacking? And what you see then is when you watch it be played out, you watch them fail and actually fail worse and get further and further and further away from the ideal. And yet God actually increases his promises throughout. Like his promises don't get smaller. His promises actually get bigger and more grand, to the point when you get to Ezekiel, he's talking about changing the whole world and making the whole world his kingdom and allowing you guys and us a part of it. Wait a minute. We started off as a nation who had 12 tribes over the Mesopotamian, Fertile Crescent. And now you're telling us we've been worse than these people back here? And now you're telling us that you're promising us a kingdom that will expand the entire earth? Like his promises got bigger. And so that's what we were supposed to see. What he wanted was Hosea 6:6. I desire loyalty and not sacrifice. Right? I desired a heart. I desired a person who wanted to, even though they knew they couldn't. Right? You ever have like a kid help you? Like a young kid, you're out maybe cutting wood. We were splitting wood, and me and my dad, and Ben's trying to pick up logs that he can't pick up, but he's trying to help. To me, that action, knowing he couldn't do it, and yet he wanted to be a part of, made me more proud of a father than, Ben, go pick up some wood. He picks up this little piece and goes, there, I picked up wood. Those are two different actions, aren't they? But Israel tried to get away with, hey, I gave my sacrifice, leave me alone. That's what it became. Because Malachi, when we get to Malachi, God says, now you're giving me lame sacrifices. You're not even trying. I know you can't give it all, but come on. Right? Give me the lame ones, the ones that can't walk, the ones that are blind, the ones that are spotted. You wouldn't give your governor these things. Shut the doors. We've got this all wrong. Wait till Jesus comes. He'll teach you. Okay? So that's what you have in the first 5 books. What you start to see then in Joshua, all the way through Kings, it's called the prophets. Okay? Even Joshua is considered a prophet. And what you see is the nation of Israel failing and failing and failing and failing over and over and over again, and yet God not abandoning them. And then you get to part 3, which is what we just finished up, and it was the writings. The writings are all about how is God going to fix this problem. Here's the ideal. Here's what they constantly do, and we're going to look at this tonight, this timeline. How is God going to fix the problem? Ultimately, it's going to all point to the Messiah. And there's been little hints throughout the whole way of these people who reflect a portion of what the Messiah should be. And yet they fail. Even David, right, a man after God's own heart, fails. Well, Jesus, there's going to be a person who's going to come who's going to be the perfect Israelite, the perfect Jew. Okay? But it's got to be God in the flesh. Okay, so that's been the last 10 weeks. That's some of the things we've been going through. If you have one of these, I've got all of the notes for the last 10 weeks in here, okay? But what I want you to do is I want you to open up this timeline. It's the very last page. And I want to explain a little bit this timeline because it can be a little bit confusing, okay? So what it does is it breaks it down by ages. Does anyone know the difference in the patriarchal age versus the Mosaic age? Anyone ever heard those distinctions? Does anyone know what patriarchy means? Patriarchy means when it is the father who is the head, right, of the family, and he's also the head of religion. So like Abraham, they didn't have priests and they didn't have Levites during the time of Abraham. This is before Moses comes, okay? So here's Moses. Moses is right here. So the book of Genesis covers Adam all the way to Joseph, right? And that's probably 2,000 years, maybe more, depending on chronology. This is what's considered the patriarchal age, which is the oldest male in the family is responsible for the sacrifice and the religion of all those underneath. That's where they set up altars, right? You'd set up these stone altars. You'd put an animal on it and sacrifice on it, okay? But you would have to do that for your family. There wasn't a priest system. There wasn't a temple. There wasn't a tabernacle. It was a father would build these altars, right? He would find an animal. He would sacrifice on it, and he would be the one sacrificing for his family, okay? Now, and that's why I believe Job was actually written during the patriarchal age, and most scholars do, because at the very beginning of Job, he's the one making sacrifices for his grown sons, his own grown sons, because how you lived under this time period, how you lived was you lived in what we'd call compounds. Some Eastern religions still live this way. So you'd have a piece of land, and the patriarch would have the main house. And let's say my son, Benjamin, he gets to marrying age, and I'm the patriarch. When he would go to marry, he would build a house on my compound, somewhere within my area, and bring his wife, and they would start their own family on this compound. Now, when I died, my firstborn would take my spot in the compound, and then everyone would kind of shift in. You would kind of shift inward, okay? And so like the center of the compound, usually the biggest house, right? All the things kind of were built around this house. That's where the patriarch and the matriarch lived in the closest living family. And then you would build, and not always on the compound, you'd build near it, but guess who was responsible for your health, your safety, your provision, and your religion? It was always the patriarch. That's why, remember when Abraham and Lot, remember when Lot gets captured? And Abraham goes and fights and rescues him? Abraham was the patriarch. That was his responsibility. If he would have let Lot be captured and not done anything about that, he would have lost his role as the patriarch. Okay? So that is where we get this idea of kinsman redeemer. Have you ever heard that term before? So here's another, once again, we're just kind of getting into the family situation. I have 3 other brothers. My oldest brother, Tim, if he died, guess who was responsible for taking care of his wife? The next born, me. Now, if I'm married, I can pass it down to my next brother, and if he's married, he can pass it down to my next brother, which my youngest brother, Corey's not married. His responsibility would be to marry my brother's wife if he's not married, and to take care of her. That's what's called the kinsman redeemer. That is why when you read the book of Ruth, remember when Ruth comes back and Boaz sees her in the field and go, why is she, I know Naomi's husband died, her husband's dead, why are they working the fields? And he goes, who's the closest kinsman redeemer? Who's the closest kin who can marry her? And they found the guy. He goes, I don't want to marry her. Because not only do you have to marry her, you take on all her debt if she has debt. And so there was a land allotment that at one time they gave up or lost. And so he had to go buy that land to get it back. So you're not just taking on the woman, you're taking on all that her family owned. It was a big deal. That's why the patriarch, the firstborn, always got a double portion. And they got the bigger portion. It wasn't because, now they're going to be richer. No, they had to take care of more responsibility. So it's, you're firstborn and you get more money and you get more land and you get more animals. But guess what? Someone dies, guess what you're having to do with your own personal belongings? You're having to go purchase or buy. And guess who's the person who's making the sacrifice for all the family? Guess who's offering up their sacrifice? Patriarch. This is really cool, okay? So in John 14, when Jesus says, in my Father's house there are many rooms. He doesn't say mansions, by the way. King James Version is wrong. He uses the Greek word that actually replaces the Hebrew word that is called the betav. The Hebrew word betav is that word compound. So when Abraham had his betav, all of his living family were in his betav. Isaac, Jacob, Joseph. Jesus is saying that when Jesus is going to prepare a place, and Justin kind of brought that up a little bit in the Greek world, remember in his devotional like last week, where a husband would go out, build a house, then go get his wife and bring her back. Well, that's what they're doing. They're bringing them into his betav. And what Jesus is saying is, my Father, who I'm going to prepare a place for you, my Father, as he's taken care of me, will also take care of you. He will pay the price. He will be your kinsman redeemer. And so going back to Boaz, Boaz goes, okay, you won't buy her, I'll buy her. I'll marry her and buy all her stuff. And then he also took in Naomi, because he has to take in all her responsibility as well. And since Ruth took responsibility for Naomi, when Boaz took responsibility of Ruth, it means he also took responsibility of everybody that she's responsible for. Okay? That's how the patriarch system worked. So if you're the top dog, it's a huge, huge weight of responsibility. In the Mosaic age, God was wanting them to get away from like individual families. He was wanting them to become a nation. Okay? And the way he first started this was he gave a law that was consistent for all of Israel. Now at first they were just 12 tribes. And so the way he rectified this was, remember he took the tribe of Levi. Does anyone know what he did with the tribe of Levi especially that he didn't do with the other 12 tribes? So all the other 12 tribes, they got a piece of land. Did the Levites get a piece of land? No. What did they get?
They were responsible for the tabernacle or whatever, and they were more like, they got the thing of God or something.
Yeah, they were priests.
Like that.
So, where's my whiteboard? Okay. So let's say this is the land of Israel, okay? This is like Crete, but this is the Dead Sea over here. These were the 12 tribes, okay? They all got their portion of land. All right, I'm not going to draw them all. So remember Joseph, because of his faithfulness, Joseph got a double portion in this, that Ephraim and Manasseh, his sons, he got 2 pieces of land. So Ephraim and Manasseh are right next to each other. And the way God did that is because he took the Levites' portion and he gave it to one of Joseph's sons. And the Levites got a portion of land in each of the tribes. And so the Levites were the priests. They took on the responsibilities of the patriarch, okay, for religion purposes and teaching the laws of God, that the patriarch, and so what it did was it united Ephraim here, wherever the Levites were set up, right? In the book of Samuel, they're in the tribe of Benjamin, or Judah, and the tabernacle happens to be at Salem. But there was 12 tabernacles. And there was a tabernacle in each. Okay? And then what we're going to see as we get into the book of Samuel, remember when they asked for a king? Well, God then starts taking all these, right? These tabernacles. Now the Levites are still there, right? They kind of do the day-to-day stuff because they're still day-to-day. He puts a temple, which he eventually will, but the tabernacle, right, comes to Jerusalem. And so now this becomes the center of religion and worship for all 12 tribes. Here's the really cool thing is, we'll get there. And then when we get past, so that only lasts, by the way. So God's whole plan was to unite them as a nation. This entire uniting of a nation, Saul was put in at 1050 BC. He lasted 40 years, King Saul. David was put as king in 1010 BC. He lasted 40 years. Solomon, he was put in 970. 40 years. 40 is kind of a number in the Bible. Moses' life is broken up into 40 years in the wilderness. So what's 40 plus 40 plus 40? So 120 years, they're living as a united nation. Now, even when they're united, are they always united? Saul spends most of his life hunting who? David. David does a pretty good job, right? Solomon spends most of his life. How many women did he have? How many wives did he have? 790. So what do you think he was doing with most of his reign as king? Finding wives. All right, there are all these ceremonies. And when he died, remember, there's Jeroboam and Rehoboam. Jeroboam comes to Rehoboam, who's the new king. So Rehoboam is the son of Solomon. And Jeroboam comes to Solomon and says, please don't be as bad as your father. Please don't be as bad as your father. Because Solomon got real bad. It was like, oh, you burnt the toast, so kill that servant. That's how Solomon ended up in his reign. Rehoboam goes, I'll be worse, my dad. I'll be worse. And so what Jeroboam does in 1930 BC, so this is 930 years before the time of Christ. That's how far we are away, okay? They take the 10 northern tribes. And because Rehoboam said what he said, and they don't want to live under another Solomon, they take their 10 tribes up here, and they form their own nation, and they go back, actually where Samuel had that temple, that tabernacle, they make that their new temple. They last 722 years. Or not 722 years. They last about 200 years to 722 BC. Now, when you're looking at your map, you see this red up here? These are all of their kings that they had during those 200 years. Do you know what the highlight of red means over them? So down low is the southern kings. Below it, you see how there's red and green? Above it is all red. Red means bad kings. Green means good kings. How many good kings did the north have? None. Evil, evil, evil. It's funny. What did they want to avoid by starting their own nation? Evil kings. What did they have? Evil kings. Okay, so that's what that means. And they get captive by the Assyrian captivity, and that happens in 2 Kings chapter 17. Does anyone remember who comes out of the Assyrian captivity that Jesus interacts with in the Gospels? What people? So the 10 northern tribes, remember? Okay, so first let me ask the question, does anyone know what Assyria did when they took captive the 10 northern tribes? What did they do with them as a people? Okay, so they were very unique. What Assyria thought, because they didn't want any rebellions, what they would do was they would split people up. They would take some people from here, and they would send them off to Crete, off to all these other different cities that they've conquered. And they would take some people from all those other cities and all intermingle them all. You know what that does? The next generation, hey, what are you? Are you Jewish or are you Assyrian? So what they did was they tried to take away any kind of, my people are the Jews and we're going to stand up and fight. Well, there was no rebellions with Assyria because by another generation, if you're born an Egyptian and a Jew, which one are you going to follow? That's where the Samaritans come from. Okay? Why the Jews hated Samaritans is because they had a little bit of Jewish blood in them. But they were the people that learned about their heritage, and yet they tried to remain Jewish even after Assyria, goes away. Babylon came and conquered Assyria. They were allowed to live, and as they lived, they realized that somewhere along their way, their roots, they had this Jewish faith, and they tried to live their Jewish faith. So when you read the woman at the well, right? The woman at the well was a Samaritan. And remember when she asked the question, hey, you Jews say you worship on your mountain, and we say we worship on our mountain. So Jerusalem There was literally two mountains. Cool. Here's the cool thing. The mountain that she's talking about back here is called the Mount of Blessing. It was a good mountain that God had at one time called the Mountain of Blessing. And Jesus says, we're not worshiping on mountains anymore. God is spirit, those who worship him in spirit and truth. But that's where the Samaritans come from. And the Jews didn't like them because now when the Babylonians captured the southern tribes, these are just two tribes. This was just Judah plus Benjamin. Okay? So only Judah and Benjamin were the southern tribes. When they got captured, what Babylon did was they took a bunch of Jews and basically did this, relocated them and gave them basically their own camp outside of Babylon. And they were basically in we'll call it a concentration camp in a sense, a refugee camp, let's call it that. But they were able to live and thrive and survive, and they grew, and eventually they actually became a part of the nation, but the Jews kind of stayed whole. And so when they were sent back 70 years later, remember they're in Babylon for 70 years, it was a 70-year captivity. 70 years later, God sends them back. Well, they're still all Jewish mostly. They had not intermingled and intermarried. So that is why when you get to Jesus' time, these Jews who are in Jerusalem that Jesus interacts with, why they don't like Samaritans? Hey, we're a full-blooded Jew. You just got partial Jew, you're worse than Gentiles. They thought Samaritans were worse than Gentiles because they only had a little bit of Jewish blood and they acted as if they were full-blood Jewish. Okay? And that's when Paul and Jesus will say things, well, you realize it's never been about how much Jewish blood you have in you. It's always been about Father Abraham and having his same faith, right? Because we look at people like Ruth. Ruth was a Canaanite. Guess how much Jew she had in her? And yet she had the faith of a Jew. Okay? And so here's Genesis through Deuteronomy is most of your history. Like when you talk about lengthwise, 2,000 years, and then all of a sudden you get to Joshua and it kind of shrinks down, and you get about 1,500 years of history from Joshua to the time of where Malachi, Nehemiah, where basically God says, I'm done with you Jews, and there's that 400 years of silence. So most of your Old Testament, so Genesis through Deuteronomy is about 2,000 years of history. And Genesis is most of those years. Because Deuteronomy is literally one day. All of Deuteronomy was written down and was said, it was one sermon from Moses in one day. Leviticus was written down probably in a week. Numbers is about 50 years, period. Exodus is 120 years. Genesis is the other 2,000. Joshua all the way through Nehemiah is about 1,500 years, and it's basically how the Jews failed, couldn't keep the law, never learned the idea of loyalty over sacrifice. Okay? All right, so what I wanted to do was kind of, because not everybody was here, kind of re-summarize a little bit, show how this chronology is going to go. What we're going to do next week is actually look at these books, what's going on in each of them, and how they line up with all these prophets. Because when you're reading your English Bible, you read Joshua, Judges, Ruth, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles. And a lot of people think they go, this book. Then you read, right, Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther, Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon, Obadiah. They're actually all happening at the same time. Like all these prophets that are going on are happening during major events in these books. And we're going to look at those major events and show, so when he's talking about this is what's going on in the economic world in Jerusalem. Okay? And you'll kind of see how this chronology, this right here to me is gold. I found this, I don't know, like 10 years ago, and it's the best one that I have found. Some of the dates I would argue with, and scholars argue over dates, but when it comes to actual content, I have to blow it up though. So if anybody wants a blown up big version laminated. I can make that for you. Any questions?
None. Clear as mud.
Clear as mud. Yes. But I mean, a lot of what you're reading is just, most of what you read, that's the point of all this. Most of what you read is just Israel failing over and over and over and over and over again, God showing mercy, and what you're looking for is that promise being renewed. God says, I'm going to redeem you. I'm going to rescue you. I'm going to redeem you through Abraham.
It really shows God's patience too.
Oh yeah, His patience, His providence. Here's the cool thing. Ephesians 1, at the very beginning, if you see at the front of your timeline, God in eternity before time planned it all. Ephesians 1, 3 through 14, when it says that from the beginning of time, God predestined all of this. Because there's a lot of times you're looking at biblical history and going, that almost seems like someone wrote that out. It's almost too perfect. Yeah, someone did. It was planned. It worked out according to God's plan. Within our free will, God shaped us and moved us in ways. That's why do you get 40, 40, 40, 40? God. And 40 then became a theological number that meant testing. They were tested under Saul. They failed. David was tested. He failed. Solomon was tested. He was to be, they thought he was the Messiah, because remember, David was promised your seed would build the temple, would be king over Jerusalem, and his kingdom would be eternal. Well, Solomon, what did he do? King over Jerusalem, he built the temple, but was his kingdom eternal? It literally split after he died. And what that's showing you is we're still waiting. It can't be a human. It cannot be a human person doing it, because we will always fail. We need a God human. All right.